All right, so hello everyone. You're here, please turn on your cameras. We are about to start. Okay, so here we are. Okay. So a quick reminder that this would be the last lecture before spring break and before the obviously the exam you're going to have on Friday. So whatever content we have today would be the last to be included in the quiz. Second, questions you have the time from now until Friday to ask me, and also tell me if you need any adjustment for like any legitimate reason you have regarding like maybe like healthcare issue, emergency matters, and such. So we've been asking a lot of questions throughout the semester, either by the examples we would discuss during class, from the assignments that you have submitted through the discussion boards. And we thought we thought that the idea is that for research, your basic idea is like to identify what is truthful and what is objectively true. And if you remember, we said in the empirical paradigm, we look at things that are observable and measurable in the hope that we can assess and we can compare related to Y, or like, can we explain how Y is caused or affected by X, right? But then we get into the practice of research, and there are a lot of questions to ask, and you could see like how we could arrive at to answers for them. So consider these questions that some of you have actually mentioned before. So, for example, have the school closures because of COVID slowed the mental development of young school kids? Right. This is the question people around the country are asking. Does exposure to images of ideal body models increase depression among young females? This is something that we've discussed multiple times before. Is there a correlation between social media use and depression among teens? That's another question. Uh, is political advertising on Instagram effective in making people more politically involved? That's also, and like you can think of like social media or like political advertising in social media. Do you know it's effective or not? Uh, that students' attendance increase when they turn their cameras on Zoom? That's also a question regarding pedagogy and educational policy and whatnot. Does the trust in vaccination increase with the level of education? So do highly educated people are more trusting of the vaccination efforts? The problem with such question is like before you get to answer them, there are problems with definitions. So for instance, what do we mean by mental development, right? Uh, for example, like what do we do? Like on what is the effect? Are we talking about small effect or like large effect? What do we mean by ideal body models? So remember, one of your discussion boards, actually many of you have raised that issue, like what is the ideal body standards? What is depression? Like how would you define, like what would be young females? What the age range you're talking about? What is political involvement? How would you define political involvement? Actually, let me ask you, how would you define political involvement? Could someone tell me if someone claiming like such and such increased political involvement, what would you think about when you hear that phrase, political involvement? What would that mean?
It could be like as basic, at least in my definition, just like maybe voting for during like election time.
Yeah, yeah, just like voting. Okay, so when someone said political involvement, that means yeah, registering to vote and voting. Okay, that's. What about another one? Like what would political involvement means?
Maybe like they're just really attentive to like the news and like politics in general. Like they just keep up on it a lot.
Yeah, so that's a different Meaning, right? So if someone is politically involved or engaged, that means they start to follow the news. You see more like ads on social media about different campaigns or different candidates, different issues. Then you start paying more attention to these issues, even if that doesn't necessarily translate into you voting. Okay, so we have two different definitions. And similar when we say student attentiveness, what would that mean? Can some of the students tell me like, what does it mean to be like someone is with someone is paying attention? What does that mean?
Like actively paying attention and like asking questions and participating in like class discussion.
Yeah, yeah. So that's one. So yeah, we could measure it. So could be by asking like this, by looking at the assignments and see if they reflect attentiveness to the topics or the concepts that were discussed during class. Okay. What about how would you, so you have a research question that says, does the trust in vaccination increase with the level of education? What would trust mean in that context?
I was thinking along the lines of like understanding, like kind of understanding how the vaccination works and how vaccines work in general. And yeah,
So you're equating trust with understanding. Is that correct?
yeah, like your trust level is dependent and is like directly correlated with your understanding of the vaccine, like the effectiveness of the vaccine.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so now you're talking about like some sort of like a cause and effect or like correlation. But what does trust mean? What do you mean when you say like, yeah, if someone trusts vaccination? What does that mean?
I'd say like, are you confident that it's going to work?
Yeah, right. So trust mean like belief it's going to work. Okay, how are you going to measure that?
Validation from
Can you think
other,
of different ways we could measure it?
yeah, validation from others that have received the vaccine and that are like showing positive results.
Right. So if you see others that took the vaccines, you're more likely to do what?
If you see others like trusting the vaccine, then you're more likely to trust the vaccine because their expectation have been fulfilled. And so you kind of expect your expectation to be fulfilled as well.
Okay. Yeah, that's one. Let me be more precise. When you say someone is trust the vaccine, yes, that they trust it, or do they have to take it? What do you think?
Well, aren't they gonna like have to take it anyway, regardless of if they trust it or not, at the end of the day?
Well, yeah, that's a different issue. But with the things that I'm trying to get to is like how when we propose concept like this or construct like this in a research question and to measure them or assess them in a real world scenario. So yeah, like the word trust, I I think everyone understands what trust means. But then in practice, how are we going to like assess objectively that this person is trusting of that thing or that other person, right? Do we look at their behavior? Do we just ask them, do you trust that vaccine? Or like, do we look at the interactions? There are many ways, right, to like measure trust, arrive at something that we could all agree upon, okay? So that question would have a true meaning. And so that's what we would call then, that's a process in specifically quantitative research, more important, like more especially in quantitative research, that when we move from conceptualization to operationalization, right? And I know operationalization is sort of like a weird word, but it is there. And it's basically how you move from just understanding something just theoretically or abstractly to giving like concrete. Remember when we talked about criteria for inclusion in content analysis? Remember that? Like when you give like concrete instructions of what would make a case belong to a category. It's similar when you then measure things like trust or political involvement or ideal body or depression. That is, you move from just talking like conceptually about something to practically measuring something. So that's when we say when we move from conceptual definition to operational definition and then having specific measurements. To remind you just like the standards, and we mentioned this before, like of empirical research, like why we do that. First of all, we said like empirical research is based on objectivity. So regardless of the subjective opinions of the researchers, the way you measure things and talk about things and investigate phenomena should be separated from your own predisposition, and it has also have to be agreed upon by the community of researchers or scientists, right? Example, I will ask people who have not. So Maura, how are you?
I'm good.
Can you tell me what's your own definition of depression?
My own definition.
Objectively. Yeah. Just
Okay.
objectively.
Like a prolonged state of feeling sad and like there's different symptoms.
Okay, that's interesting. So a prolonged, that's an important distinction. A prolonged feeling of like, okay, prolonged sense of feeling sad. Okay, so why you said prolonged? Why that distinction?
Because I feel like sometimes people confuse like depression with just feeling like sad sometimes. Like you can feel sad here and there, but depression's like a very like, it's like a duration that's like an extended period of time where you feel like really sad.
Okay. Okay, so here Maura is doing what Maura is doing is giving a conceptual definition to differentiate depression from sadness. Okay, so she's saying like sadness is one thing, depression is another thing. All right, so that's a conceptual definition. Then when researchers are doing, so that's like an objective, so a prolonged sense of sadness, okay? And then I'll add that had like some apparent, that makes some apparent changes of someone's physical and emotional state, okay. Now, if we then, all of us agree, so that's like would be an objective definition, right? Okay, so we differentiated it from other things. Now, when once we have that, we need consistency in measurement because there is another problem posed by that definition of what do we mean by prolonged, right? Is it like what, like 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 1 month, 2 months? What is prolonged, right? And more importantly, what is sad and what signs of sadness you're looking to? Can someone tell me, okay, if like what signs of sadness would you see in a person?
Not necessarily laziness, but not wanting to work or not having any motivation.
Okay, lack of motivation, melancholy. That's I think what they call it. Okay, lack of motivation. What else? How would you know that your friend or your sibling or your roommates are sad?
They're
Um,
used.
Oh, sorry, you can go.
No, you're all
Go
good.
ahead, Sarah. Sarah, go ahead.
Okay, I would say sometimes they socially isolate themselves and kind of hang by themselves. And then there's like decreased energy levels or maybe sleep or appetite.
Yeah, that's wonderful. So what Sarah we're saying now is that step, sort of getting into the operational definition. That is to say, okay, what we mean by sadness are these things, right? So you're going to see like, okay, so lack of motivation, social isolation, lack of appetite, sleep disturbance. Lisa here saying they're quiet, so lack of social and interpersonal engagements. That's what we call operational definition. So we are now specifically talking about observable things. And those, once we agree upon, we would then have consistency. Like, why do we need to have these particular and very specific criteria? Because we need consistency and falsifiability, right? Because once we agree as, let's say, a community of scholars in psychology or social sciences that, okay, here's what depression mean in practical terms. We can all measure it for different studies and then compare, right? Because if Maura is defining depression in one sense and I'm defining it in another sense, then our whatever research we do is unrelated to one another because we could be speaking about totally different, two different things, right? But then once we have consistency in measurement, then anyone, okay, if you do a study in depression in one community and I study another community, then yeah, our results are comparable. Secondly, or that should be firstly, but anyhow, the issue of testability, right? Or falsifiability. Does anyone remember what we mean by falsifiability? What do you mean by saying something is falsifiable?
Is it
It can be
related to like?
proven.
Sorry, you can go.
No, it's you got.
Oh no, I was just gonna say like, is it related to like how easily something can be tested, or how easily something can be proven wrong?
Yeah. Well, not necessarily easily. It could be it could be difficultly, but yeah. It's like if something could be proven wrong, right? And if you remember, yeah, so it's something that we could actually measure and show if it meets a certain threshold or standard or not. And so, for example, like I feel depressed. We say that sometimes, but when you're just talking like just like colloquially about he's depressed, he's sad, this is fantastic, right? It's all just empty words. But once something like you have like a standardized form of measuring it become falsifiable, right? I'll give you like I give you for example. So when we say, for example, when we talk about basketball players, like who the best basketball player in the history, right? And people would come up with in the history of the NBA, and people would come up with different answers. But all of these claims are like just empty or meaningless unless we agree on something, right? So is it like how many championship have that player gotten? How many scores in a game? How many like individual games the player won? Like, is it like about some specific metrics? So unless we agree on some test or standardized testing, speaking of which, then yeah, all of these claims about who's best than another are just subjective statements, right? But when we do empirical quantitative research, we're looking for something standardized. And so those are the things. And finally, on operationalization, especially when you go to measure it, like we need validity. That is to say that the standard we agree upon is actually measuring the things we're talking about, right? So it needs to be testable, i.e. observable, and it needs to be related. So it could be, for instance, that um, so if you just look, for example, at lack of appetite and link it to depression, so it could be actually related. But if we just look at that, it won't give us the full picture of if depression is happening or not, right? So it could be one component, but it's not valid enough to assess the whole like a spectrum of depression. Because as a matter of fact, and this is weird, but in some sometimes depression leads to actually uplifting your appetite, especially for sugary stuff. So yeah, why is that? Why do we need to talk about this? So especially in the social sciences, uh, all of you are in a social science major, right? So I know rhetoric communication, we have poli science, but no one from the natural sciences. Okay. When we talk, so the things when people in natural sciences talk about whatever phenomenon they are discussing. So when they talk about gravity or deforestation or burning or eruption or climate change, they are actually most of the time, not always, by the way, but most of the time they are talking about things that are tangible, right? Things that could be measured physically, things that could be observed by the naked eye or the non-naked eye for that matter, right? You're studying like you're studying vaccine, you're studying, let's say, treatment of like an infection or disease. Yeah, the way uh, we won't have a problem, like leave the technical side apart, but we won't have a problem arguing about what treatment is. Like if the virus is still active, you haven't treated the patient. If the virus is inactive or dead, you have treated the patient, right? It's that simple. Simple means when we talk about it, not actually when you develop the medication. And so yeah, another example like respiration. So I could measure the climate, and I could measure like study the soil in the Amazons, right? So each of these things could be like tangibly, physically, and precisely defined and measured, okay? In the social sciences, however, um, we are actually not looking into things that are tangible necessarily, right? I think it's everything we study, let's say in communication studies or in social science in general. So when we say like depression or motivation, persuasion, attitude change, active participation, attentiveness, all of these are things that are just conceptual constructs, but you cannot see, there's no such thing as depression you would see when you could physically touch in the real world, right? Those are concepts we attach to a collection of behaviors and attitudes and emotions we know in our guts that we feel them really, they exist, right? But they don't have like a physical or like a tangible presence. Therefore, the problem of testability in the social sciences is that we have to actually make those things measurable first, i.e., coming up with some also standards, and then try to do our testing. So those things in qualitative research, we say like qualitative research, you could just explore concepts, right? So if you remember the qualitative research studies we've talked about, like you can go and talk to a group of female college students, talk about their use of Instagram, the influences or like the people they follow, how would that make them feel about themselves and their bodies and all of that. And you're looking for like the intersubjective experiences of all of these participants. Whereas when we get into quantitative research, you would be interested to test a relationship. Okay? The testing again would mean like detail possibility and all of the criteria we talked about, right? In testing, and if you remember, I said you would have a hypothesis. So you have a proposition of which things would change what, or the relationship between X or Y, or what we call the independent variable, that is the predictor, and the dependent variable, right? And so your goal is to show that the relationship between those two things are more than random, not happening by chance, but there's an actual cause and effect or correlation associated between the two. To put more concretely, so for the example we were talking about in assignment 3, for some of you who submitted it, if there's a relationship between Instagram use and let's say, if we want to test that hypothesis, if you say there is a relationship, like people, like in a college, like a female students in a college campus. But what we were saying earlier, you have to define what you mean by body image dissatisfaction precisely, offer a standard measurement, we measure it, and then also you have a standard measurement for Instagram use or types of use or whatever you're arguing, and then test the relationship, right? And so quantitative research is built around those things, right? Like you have first of all, sort of like objective definitions, standardization of measurement, and then testing observable variables. Okay. What we do, we deal with different questions. So we deal with like attitudinal and behavioral variables. So attitudinals means something like you feel positively, negatively about. So hate, like, love, following, engaging, disengaging. Behavioral variable is something you actually do, i.e. actions. So physical practice or how many hours you spend on online gaming, etc. They're not tangible. We don't have a physical presence, but still that you have to have some objective and observable measurement for that. And so, and this is sort of a review though, because we talked about these things before. Can someone tell me what is a variable? Can you give me an example of a variable? And I told you. Okay, I'll pick someone. Let's do it randomly. Okay, Sarah. Sarah, you here?
Yes.
Actually, the other Sarah, Sarah Kushner.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I didn't.
I'm here. I was just gonna say that I guess a variable could be like any facet of research, or like any thing that can be measured within a research study.
Such as, can you give an example?
I'm trying to think of like a specific example, but I guess just like any, can't it be like qualitative or quantitative that you're like measuring to see some sort of relationship? I can't give like a specific example, but
Yeah, like for example, anything you study, or anything we mentioned. So, what would be a variable?
Age or income could be one.
Pardon?
Age or income could be one.
Yeah. Right. So that's exactly right. So what Sarah said is like, yeah, age and income could be measured, and they could be then tested in terms of a relationship to another thing. So a variable is anything that vary, and you could measure it. So age, income, happiness, sadness, depression, enthusiasm, like activism, etc. Right? In qualitative research, as we've mentioned, as we've been going through, those things could be measured based on impressions and intersubjective interpretation. So if you remember in the interpretive paradigm, so yeah, you like let's say in ethnography, like you go to a place and you take field notes based on what you observe, right? Like people were happy or excited about this, or there was like a tense relationship between those two, some actors or some groups. Those all are all based on impressions, so they don't have like a standardized measurement. Like we still say they are variables because they give us like an intersubjective or like a diversity of points of views that we could use later in what we call quantitative research or empirical research. The difference in quantitative research is that all of the variables have to be measured numerically, hence quantitative. And so the reason we do that is that we want to draw associations between them in a hypothesis. Because once we have numbers, once we have standardized numerical measurement, we can then measure, for instance, if there's a relationship between, let's say, the variable of income and the variable of happiness, right? Both would be measured on some numerical scale. So we could look at a correlation, positive or negative, or we could look into association between hours spent on Instagram and body image depression or dissatisfaction, those sort of things, right? So a variable, as we mentioned, so have like, when you define it, have two things. It could either be, so you could, there are two ways. We said there are two definitions. There is the conceptual definition. That is to say, if someone doesn't know the term and you ask them, and then they ask you, and then you explain it to them, right? So when you ask about depression, it's a prolonged sense of sadness that affect the psychological and emotional well-being of an individual. That's a conceptual definition, all right? Then you will get into an operational definition, which is you specify what you measure it. And so that entails what we would call developing items or measurement items you would then use on a scale, right? So you would see something pretty developed, like the depression scale. You would have 16 questions you could fill on a survey, and we'd have a scale either from 1 to 5, 1 to 7, 1 to 10, and those would make up what you would call the operational definition. Operational means like the precise or like the measurable definition, right? So here is another example. So when you talk about brand liking, okay, so conceptual definition, the assessment or appeal a customer has for a brand. Operational definition, then whoever the market researcher would ask you like survey items such as, I feel attached to this brand, or I approve of this brand, or I like the products of this brand, right? So you would then have a question from like 1 to 5, from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And whatever those items are, would operationally, i.e. practically, constitute what we mean by brand liking, okay? So I think this is so this is sort of repetitive because yeah, things. Okay, and so I'm going to do something similar to what we've done. So also I'm going to end the class earlier today. I'm going to have like a short video. I only have 4 slides left, so I'm going to leave it for a short video. That would have a quiz embedded. All right. So it's the same way we did last time. So please answer them. This video would be shorter, I promise. But before we leave, though, do you have any questions regarding the midterm or the review guide? Yes, Maura.
Is the exam going to be the same length as the last one?
Yeah.
Okay.
By the way, the timing was appropriate, right? Because I didn't see anyone. No one even took the full time, by the way. Everyone got like finished it, between 20 to 35 minutes.
Does it get released at 8 a.m. or before?
I'll try to make it earlier though. Okay.
Okay,
Like
yeah.
because some people ask me if they want to take it at 7. Yes, I'll make it from 7 to 11. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Oh, I said it was great. Thank you. Okay. Any other questions?
It's about the same style as the last one, correct?
Yeah.
Okay,
Right,
perfect.
right.
Perfect.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think you get my style. But like you would see that I mostly ask for example and then tell you what this question was talking about, right? This is mostly what I do. Like here's like a scenario, researcher wants to investigate blah, blah, blah. So they did A and B. What is that method? And then it would be like focus group, interview, ethnography. It's a way to assess if you understand something rather than if you just memorize some definition or Google some definition on the web. So yeah, pay attention though. So these are the things you should pay attention to. Don't pay attention to like there's some definition in like birds somewhere in the reading or like some footnote. But if you just understand like how focus groups work, how interviews work, why do we sometimes use interviews rather than focus groups or vice versa? Or what is ethnographic research? What are the limitations of each of these methods? You'll be okay. So I'm gonna focus mostly on like the bulk of what we've been discussing for the last 3 weeks, I believe, or 4 weeks. I sort of forgot. Like yeah, mostly about the method parts, like the actual methods. So pay more attention to those. And then we also discussed the differences. If I tell you about something and you would know the difference between different sampling methods or approaches, you would be fine as well. Okay, so if you have any question, I'll see you.